Well, welcome you again tonight. And so next Sunday evening, I should say, we're going to begin our series on prayer. And I kind of pushed it back a week because I kind of wanted to give a little bit of time for people, if they wanted to buy a book, to sign up and give us some time to get the books in and that kind of thing. So I kind of pushed it back a week and did something else for this week tonight. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be an exposition from Scripture per se, but it's going to be basically an apologetic sermon. And what that means is apologetics is basically the discipline of the defense of the faith. It's not an apology for being a Christian. Rather, the word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give an answer or reason or defense. When Peter writes and he says, always be prepared to give a reason or an answer or defense for the hope that is within you, that's the Greek word apologia. And so I just thought this would be interesting to you, and maybe more than that, would be helpful to you, encouraging to you that there was a certain period within church history, in maybe the past late 1800s and up to through the late 1900s, where especially in universities and things like that, people looked kind of down on Christianity. Basically, they thought, well, if you're a Christian, you have to kind of check your brain at the door. But we now, there's just so much strong evidence out there, and there's so much easier access to it now than there ever has been. You can have confidence in what you believe. Trust me. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. But let me pray, and then we'll get right in. So, Lord, we know that the ultimate reason we believe in you is because Jesus Christ meets us just like he met Paul on the road to Damascus. We see you, Lord, with eyes of faith. We behold you like we've never beheld you before. We know that we cannot convince people, Lord, with just sheer intellectual arguments concerning Christianity. But nevertheless, if something is true, it's true. And so, Lord, we ask that you would teach us truth, that you would help us to hold firmly the faith once for all delivered to the saints. And I pray that you would give us a confidence, not an arrogance, Lord, but a confidence, Lord, that not only does Christianity satisfy the deepest longings of our heart, but it is also objectively, historically true. And that is the only thing, in fact, that gives it its power. That Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. And that's our hope. So minister to us tonight, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So tonight we're going to talk about, did Jesus really rise from the dead? I kind of intended to do this closer to Easter, but it didn't work out, so you get it now. So there you go. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? So as I've said many times before, Christianity is rooted in historical reality, and that makes it rather unique of the other religions, even the monotheistic religions like Islam and Judaism, which just believe in one God like we do. We're actually very similar to Judaism, of course, because we share the same history up till Christ, but they obviously reject Christ. But Islam, for example, is just based on Muhammad, who claims to have vision of angels, and that's where he received the Quran, etc. But Christianity is rooted in historical reality, not vague spiritual ideas. Christianity is not first about being a better person or keeping a bunch of rules. Christianity is first about a man named Jesus Christ who really lived, really died, really rose from the dead, who's really coming back, and that really changes everything. The resurrection, of course, is Jesus' greatest miracle because it fully and finally confirms his identity. It confirms that he did what he said he would do and that he accomplished what he said he would accomplish. Namely, Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. The wages of sin, the Bible says, is death. Jesus, in conquering sin, has conquered death. And he proved that once and for all by rising from the dead. And so, if this is true, of course, then it demands a different way of looking at the world. Well, I've mentioned some of these before, but we're going to have them up on the screen here. But they're even from skeptical non-Christian scholars, basically, there are 12 essentially universally agreed upon facts concerning the days around Jesus' death and resurrection. So even non-Christian scholars, there's pretty much universal consensus on these 12 facts based off of the historical evidence. Number 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Number 2, he was buried, most likely in a private tomb. Number 3, soon afterwards, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. Number 5, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Number 6, due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. Number 7, the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early, from the beginning of church history. Number 8, the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. Number 9, the gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. 10, Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worshiping. 11, James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before this time, was converted when he believed he also saw the risen Jesus. 12, just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So I want you to think about what I've just said. These are not controversial statements. Even among people who aren't Christians, historically speaking, everything I just said is non-controversial statement. These things, historically speaking, you can trust in these things as much as you trust that George Washington was the president of the United States. Any historical belief, requires basically some level of trust in the evidence, the historical evidence that we have for those things. And these statements are just not controversial. The question is, what can explain the fact that these 12 things happened? And it turns out that despite all the twisting and finagling of trying to get out of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, there's really no satisfactory explanation for the fact that these 12 things occurred, except that what they said happened actually happened, and that is that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the dead. So why do we accept these 12 facts? Well, again, most scholars and even skeptical scholars now there's just some things that we just have to admit. For example, the New Testament, number 1, is not a legend. The New Testament is not a legend. The New Testament, as you know, is a collection of documents written by early eyewitness accounts or associates of eyewitnesses who claimed that they actually saw the things that they wrote about with their own 2 eyes. And so these documents were written within 2 generations of the actual events, and were written by eyewitnesses or their contemporaries. And the storyline of the Bible is actually corroborated by a handful of extra biblical sources. That is, non-Christian writers around the same time actually record things that basically confirm the biblical storyline being written by the writers of the New Testament. In addition, there are more than 30 historical figures mentioned in the New Testament that have been confirmed by archaeology and history. And so it's not legendary. If you've ever read a legend, you know that they just make up characters and there's no real correlation to reality. And myths were very popular at that time. That was the time of the Greek gods, the Greek and Roman gods. They actually worshiped those gods at the time of the writing of the New Testament. You could go back and read those myths. They're nothing like the New Testament. If you read the New Testament, it's painfully obvious that those who were writing it were just very plainly understood that what they were doing was writing down what they saw happened. They were being historians, basically. So the New Testament is not a legend. Number two, the New Testament is not a lie. The New Testament includes embarrassing details, specifically about the disciples. If you were making up a religion, you wouldn't write its founding documents and make yourself look like a fool. But that's what they do, over and over again. The New Testament also contains difficult sayings. Jesus says some things that are kind of hard to understand and kind of hard to explain. One example is Jesus says, I don't even know when I'm coming back. That's a problem. That's a problem, theologically speaking, because, it's very clear early on that the church taught Jesus was God. Well, if you were making up a religion, you would just cut that out because that doesn't fit what you're teaching, but they included it because Jesus said it. In places of the New Testament, they encourage readers to verify their statement. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 said, as many as 500 people at one time saw Jesus Christ alive. Why would Paul say that? Because he's telling the Corinthians, go ask them. Go find the people and ask them. In other words, he's inviting them to verify his statements. He's not saying, just take my word for it. He's saying, go verify my statements. And finally, I think most compellingly, the eyewitnesses, the writers of the New Testament, endured persecution and martyrdom for their empirical claim that Jesus Christ physically, bodily rose from the dead. Again, this is important. It is not like a modern-day Muslim, a radical, for example, who goes and blows up himself for Allah. Because he is taking his faith on Allah based off the testimony of Muhammad. But we're talking about something different. We're talking about if there were people who made up Christianity, it would be these people. And yet they are the same ones who are willing. In other words, you would have to say that they willingly endured great persecution and martyrdom for something they knew was a lie. And that just doesn't make sense. So the New Testament is not a lie, it's not a legend. Finally, it's not an embellishment. It would be kind of tempting to say, well, they were just very fond of this Jesus guy, so they kind of just embellished his story to make him look a little bit better than he actually was. The thing is that if you read the Bible, especially the various accounts, you can tell that there's just not a whole lot of embellishment there. Now, there are well over 100, I'm sure hundreds of historically, by now, and archaeologically confirmed details in the New Testament. And you could just take the book of Acts, for example. The book of Acts, Luke writes with remarkable precision. Even anyone who's a historian, even if they're not a Christian, recognizes that historically speaking, Luke, in writing the book of Luke and Acts, is profoundly careful. And they found where, like, Luke says this and this, we went from here to here, that was a day's journey. We went from here to here, that was 2 days' journey. It's all been confirmed. He has named specific people who had specific roles of authority in the Roman government, and they have found, seals or inscriptions that verify that was the name of that person. And Luke even gave them the correct title, because the different people in various regions had different titles associated with that role. And Luke would name them. In this town, he was the proconsul. In this town, he was the governor. In this town, he was this. Luke is actually remarkably precise in his recording. And in the same document where Luke is incredibly careful to include accurate details, he also says, and then we went to this town, and so was healed. And so was raised from the dead. But he doesn't make a big deal out of it. He just keeps writing. And then we did this, and so was healed, and then we did this. He's not embellishing. He's just saying what happened. It's pretty clear if you read it. It's not extravagant. It's very clear that he understands that he's recording what he's seeing, what he has researched and understand. And so we can believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament authors accurately recorded what they saw. And so really then there is only one course left for the skeptic concerning the validity of the resurrection of Christ. And that is, again, based off of everything I've just explained, it's really difficult, borderline impossible to say that they were lying or they were deceiving. And so really the only way, and again, historically speaking, those 12 facts concerning Jesus' resurrection are very hard to discount. And so really, if you're still skeptical, the only option you have left is to basically say this, that the disciples really did believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but they were mistaken. That's about the only option you have left. And that's what a lot of scholars will say today. And so basically a lot of theories have come about concerning how the disciples, they really believed Jesus rose from the dead, but that's just because they were mistaken. And so people have come up with these theories. I want to explain some of them to you and explain why they don't really hold water. The first theory is this. It's called the hallucination theory. That is that basically people say, well, the disciples they hallucinated. They were under a lot of stress. They were really afraid. And so the disciples just hallucinated upon seeing Jesus. Well, this is probably the weakest of them all because it's not a documentary actually, it's a movie, but it's based off of the life of Lee Strobel, who's going to be at the men's conference that we're going to. The men, if you haven't signed up for that, you can. And but he worked for the Chicago Tribune, and he was a journalist, and he took his journalism skills to investigate historically because he was a crime journalist. And think about when you're trying to investigate a crime, what are you doing? You're trying to investigate what happened in the past, right? Well, so he was perfectly equipped to investigate, did Jesus rise from the dead? So he did this research, and he was an atheist, and then he was converted because he concluded that the evidence was so strong that Jesus rose from the dead. But in the movie, he talks to a clinical psychologist at a university who herself is not a Christian, but she says mass hallucinations are impossible because if we all hallucinate, we're not all going to have the same hallucination. I'm going to hallucinate about something, you're going to hallucinate about something else. So all the disciples could not have mass hallucinations. And besides this, out of 6 of the 12 sightings of appearances in the New Testament, on 6 of the 12, Jesus specifically is said to touch or eat food. In other words, he's confirming his physical nature, his reality, that he's not a mere hallucination or a vision or a ghost. And, of course, the greatest reason why this theory doesn't hold water is because in the hallucination theory can't explain the empty tomb. In other words, if all they did was hallucinate, then all the Jews had to do was go open up Jesus' tomb and there's his body. That's it. Christianity's over. But that doesn't hold water. The second theory is this. It's the wrong tomb theory. Some people say, well, the disciples went to the wrong tomb and that's why it's empty. Well, again, this doesn't work because the Jews and the Romans, who had every reason not to want Jesus alive, would have went to the right tomb and showed everybody his body. And again, the end of Christianity. And it also doesn't explain the appearances of if they went to the wrong tomb, it doesn't offer any explanation of the appearances that the disciples saw. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, everybody forgot. Everybody went to the wrong place. And it doesn't explain what turned the disciples from cowards to bold proclaimers of the resurrection. Because the New Testament actually makes clear, John and Peter ran to the tomb and they saw it empty. But they were not changed by seeing the empty tomb. They were changed when they saw Jesus alive. They were still, in fact, the Bible says they were still skeptical when they saw the empty tomb. They didn't know what happened. And so it doesn't explain the change in the disciples' life. It was the appearances of Jesus that gave them boldness. The third theory is called the swoon theory. Swoon theory. And that is, basically, this theory says, well, Jesus didn't die. In other words, he went on the cross, but he didn't die from the cross. He just appeared dead. So there's lots of problems with this one. One is that the Romans were really good at crucifying people. They were really good. They crucified a lot of people. Jesus was not the only person to be crucified. They crucified a ton of people. They were professional executioners. Second, in the New Testament, it actually says that Pilate checked and had someone check to make sure that Jesus was dead. Thirdly, think about what happened to Jesus. He was scourged. If you've seen the Passion of Christ, I mean, he was almost dead before they even crucified him, because the scourging that he experienced, he had probably had profound blood loss. That's why he was too weak to carry his own crossbeam, and that's why they had to get Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross for him. Jesus also had the spear thrust into his side, where blood and water were released, and that's an actual condition which medical professionals say that. I don't know the name of it exactly right now, but it's the condition where basically it confirms that he was dead. And again, that just there was actually an article in the American Journal of Medical something that where they analyzed the evidence of the crucifixion in typical Roman crucifixions, and basically these medical doctors say that it would be impossible to survive this. That is, that there's no way that Jesus could have survived it. And so let's suppose for a moment that somehow Jesus actually did survive these injuries. So this is what we would have to say to hold this theory. You would have to say that the people who wrapped him up in bandages somehow didn't notice that he was alive. And then he would then have to survive 36 hours in a cold tomb with no medical care after the injuries he sustained. And then he would have to move a 2-ton rock, get past armed Roman guards, and then in the same state with no medical help, he appears to his disciples and they believe he has victoriously risen from the dead. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, the swoon theory. And so that's the third theory. The fourth theory is that the disciples stole the body. The fourth theory is that the disciples stole the body. So there's lots of problems with this as well. How could the disciples have gotten past the trained guards? But of course, the most important evidence against this is the fact that all of them just about went to martyrs' deaths, proclaiming the claim that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. And so it just doesn't make sense that they had nothing to gain. Think about it. They had nothing to gain. They were all devout Jews. Okay? Judaism was, it was part of who they were. Okay? And so Christianity is fundamentally changing that. It's fundamentally changing the way they relate to other Jews. They had nothing to gain. Their Lord and their Master has died. They have nothing to gain from lying about it. Nothing. And yet, all of them, just about all of them, died martyrs' deaths, saying that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. You have to explain that. Number 5, another theory, is that a substitute took Jesus' place. This has kind of been popularized by Muslims because the Quran actually says that Jesus was not crucified but only appeared to be crucified. And many Muslims take that to mean that basically that Jesus wasn't crucified, that it was somebody else, that somebody looked like Jesus was crucified. So besides the fact that there's absolutely no evidence to support that claim, that the Quran was written nearly 600 years after the events of Jesus, after the life of Jesus, besides that, how could Jewish leaders, Roman officials, and Jesus' closest friends and family all be mistaken about who they were crucifying? So, when you watch movies and stuff, lots of times the crosses are kind of displayed at like really tall and everyone's kind of standing far back. But there's not really a lot of evidence necessarily to support that. It's very likely that Jesus was only a foot or two off the ground. Think about it. That makes it easier for the Romans, right? They don't have to lift this huge log. I mean, he's just a few feet off the ground. And they crucified people for the express purpose that people could come and see them and know what they do, so they wouldn't. It was like public hangings, right? It was a deterrent. So they made it visible. They made it obvious for people so that people could come by and see, and so that they wouldn't do what this person did. And so it doesn't make any sense at all that they could all be mistaken concerning the man that was on the cross. And finally, the last theory that some have put forward is that the disciples' faith led them to believe in the resurrection. And basically, this is just saying that they wanted to believe it so badly that they kind of convinced themselves that it happened. But again, I mean, it just doesn't make sense because they didn't have faith to believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe Jesus when he said he was going to rise from the dead. They were afraid and they were confused. They were not faith-filled people. That's the whole point. They didn't believe. So they certainly didn't have enough faith to believe in a resurrection that didn't happen. Because they barely had enough faith to believe in a resurrection that did. They were cowards. And only it was after they saw Jesus rise from the dead that they were changed into bold proclaimers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And of course, that last one, the theory that Jesus' disciples, their faith led them to believe in the resurrection again, that it doesn't account for the empty tomb either. And so what do we make of this? Well, many people who reject the resurrection, they reject it not really because of the evidence or lack thereof, because I think the evidence is quite strong. Rather, they reject it because they are presuppositionally committed to a world in which miracles can't happen. In other words, they have a naturalistic worldview. They don't believe in God, and so they cannot be open to the possibility that miracles happen because their worldview can't account for it. It doesn't account for it. So in other words, no matter what the evidence says, if you're presuppositionally committed to it, then miracles can't happen regardless of what the evidence says. In other words, they're cut off to it. It doesn't matter what you say, that miracles can't happen regardless of the evidence because they're already committed to a worldview in which miracles can't happen. But that's just unfortunate because when you look at the historical evidence, it's so incredibly strong. I mean, you look at Jesus and his life. I mean, it's undeniable that this man was a miracle worker. You have all the New Testament documents, and they're recording these virtually. I mean, John says all the books in the world couldn't contain the stuff Jesus did. If they didn't have special effects back then, folks. They didn't have Jesus was not David Copperfield. They didn't have all just the sheer number of miracles that Jesus is said to have performed. Once somebody can trick somebody a few times, but nobody can trick thousands of people every day for 3 years straight without something substantially different being about that man. It's just it doesn't make sense. You know, I was talking to a student at Auburn University one time. We were talking, and I don't remember exactly how the conversation went. But eventually we got to the point, and I just kind of, I think the question was asked, or maybe I asked him or a friend of mine did, you know, what would it take for you to believe in God? You know, what would make you believe? And And I think he said something, and like what lots of people say, well, if God just gave me a miracle, if God just, if something miraculously happened, right? If someone just popped in that chair, really terrified this pastor. It'd be really scary if someone just popped in that chair, okay? And, but would that make you believe in God? And the guy was like, well, maybe. And he was like, yeah, I think so. And then I looked at him and I said, you know what? I don't think you would. Maybe shouldn't talk to folks like that. But that's what I said, really? I don't think you would. I think if something miraculous happened right now, I think what you would tell yourself is, where's the camera? Where's the magic trick? Where's the illusion? In other words, and he said, yeah, you're right. In other words, there is nothing that could convince him that God is real. It's not because of lack of evidence. It's because he doesn't want to believe. Why? Because if God is real, it means your life has to change. And people don't want to believe in that. And so in order to be consistent with the way they want to live their life, it's much easier for them to just say there is no God. Regardless of in other words, it's not a matter of evidence or not. Jesus told a story about the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man said, Abraham, send Lazarus up to tell my brothers that I'm in torment. Abraham told Lazarus, even if a man should rise from the dead, they won't believe. They have the scriptures. Let them believe it. There's no reason, I think, so many people are so skeptical, but if you think about it, there's really no reason to be so skeptical about miracles, and especially about the miracle of the resurrection. Because I think the evidence for the existence of God is just incredibly, profoundly strong. I don't know. I mean, for example, why does anything exist? Why does anything exist in the first place? Why isn't there just nothing? And everybody, and even scientists, know that the universe had a beginning. It hasn't always existed. And so if something has a beginning, how does something come from nothing? That means the scientists, they want to call it the Big Bang, but what is the Big Bang? It is literally everything in the universe popping out of thin air into everything. It's nothing becoming something. What is that? It's a miracle. It's literally a miracle. And yet when you baptize it in scientific terms, they don't call it that. But if God exists, Paul, when he was talking to Felix, I think it was, he said, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God should raise a man from the dead? If God exists and he is anything like the Bible describes him to be, a God of all power, then it's really not that big of a deal for him to raise a man from the dead. It's really not. And so finally, there's something else I want to address, and that is this. Some people say something like this, and it's kind of like a way to wiggle out. And they basically say, well, yeah, the evidence is fine and good, but I don't find it finally convincing. And when you make extraordinary claims like that, you must have extraordinary evidence. In other words, they don't flat out refute you. They kind of admit you have some evidence, but they basically say, well, it's just not enough for such claims like we're talking about. Well, there's just a few questions concerning that. When someone says extraordinary evidence, well, we need extraordinary evidence for this kind of claim. My question is, what do you mean by extraordinary evidence? Do you mean like a supernatural evidence, like you want another miracle to confirm the past miracle? Well, that just goes back to what I just said before. Most people who are committed to naturalistic worldview, even if they saw a miracle, they still wouldn't believe. They would say, I had too much to drink or something else. You know what I'm saying? They wouldn't believe it. They still wouldn't believe it. Or if they mean by extraordinary evidence, is it repeatable? Like in a scientific lab? Well, no, of course it can't be repeatable because it's a historical event. You can't bottle up a historical event and recreate it in the laboratory. In other words, historical inquiry by definition is different than scientific inquiry. But nevertheless, we can still make reasonable conclusions from it. For example, my wife, this morning for breakfast, I ate waffles and sausage balls. Can I empirically prove, is there any way I can prove to you that I had waffles and sausage balls for breakfast? This just happened a few hours, folks. No, I can't prove it to you. I can't. I think even if you cut up my stomach right now, there probably wouldn't be conclusive evidence, okay? All right? The nature of historical claims is you can't bottle them up and put them in a laboratory. But is it reasonable for you to trust me when I say that and to draw the conclusion, and to believe me when I say that? Of course it is. You have no reason not to believe me and no reason for me to lie about it. And anytime if something in a court of law and something happens and someone says, well, I was there and I saw it, there's good reason to believe it. You're not a fool to believe it. You're not an idiot to believe it. You're not an intellectual, throwing everything out to believe it. You're just being reasonable because when someone says they saw it and you have reasonable evidence to believe that person, then you're reasonable to believe them. Well, the Bible was written by men who were eyewitnesses of the events in which they proclaimed. They held to what is the most beautiful ethical system in the world, where they held holiness and integrity before God in high honor because God always sees you and always knows you and knows whether you're telling the truth. And just about all of them went and died martyr deaths for their testimony. I would believe that man. If tradition is right and the Apostle Peter was crucified upside down, as tradition said he was, and if I saw Peter crucified upside down and he was hanging there and I walked up to him and said, did Jesus rise from the dead? And he looked me in the eye and said, yes, I would say, I believe you. It would be perfectly reasonable to believe him. And so when it comes to historical claims, those things are perfectly reasonable. And then the final question is this. To be consistent, do you demand such extraordinary evidence for other beliefs? In other words, if you demand such extraordinary evidence for this belief, do you demand that same kind of evidence for other beliefs? For example, we could take evolution, for example. Evolution is a fascinating it's fascinating in terms of science because evolution is historical science. That is, you cannot observe evolution. Because the claim, by definition, is that it takes millions of years for it to happen. How can you observe a process that takes millions of years to occur? You can't. So in other words, you have to make interpolations and extrapolations to come to that conclusion because it's unobservable. But the irony is, we can observe gravity, so sure. But many scientists treat evolution as if it's gravity when you can't observe it. It's on a totally different plane. And no one denies, so this is my view, no one denies in speciation. In other words, so Charles Darwin, he saw the finches, different food, different times, different contexts. The finches, they had different kinds of beaks developed in the different climates and when the weather changed and things like that. It changed from one specific type of finch with certain characteristics still a finch but with different kinds of characteristics. To me that's undeniable. But here's the key. It's still a finch. In other words, you could observe one finch changing into a different kind of finch, just like I could have, a Chihuahua, bless its heart, could mate with a Great Dane, and you could have some crazy-looking dog, okay, but it's still a dog. It's still a dog. But you cannot observe a finch becoming a dog, and there's really no evidence for it. It's an extrapolation. It's assumption that if they could change a little bit, they can change a lot. But how do you know that assumption is true? It's a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith to jump from microevolution or speciation to macroevolution. It's a leap of faith. You're extrapolating from the evidence. Here's another example. Extraordinary evidence. This is a historical example. Take Alexander the Great. If you read a history book, they will tell you all kinds of great facts with a great deal of confidence, mind you, about the man named Alexander the Great. And you could go in your school textbooks, and the historians will write about Alexander the Great, and they'll tell you he did this, and they won't qualify it. They'll just say, we know he did this, he did this. Do you know that the earliest works that we have that even tell us that Alexander the Great even existed are fragments of documents that were written over 100 years after he lived? And that the vast majority of the things written in our historical textbooks about what Alexander the Great actually did come from documents 300 to 500 years after he died. And that's in your history textbooks about Alexander the Great. And no one questions whether he lived. No one questions whether he did what the things say he did. They just accept it. Compare this to the New Testament, all of which were written in less than 100 years of the events in which they described, within the lifetimes of those people who knew Jesus. And in fact, the New Testament contains what most scholars believe to be hymns and creeds that are traceable to within years of Jesus' death and resurrection. If you can't believe this, you can't believe in any historical event. I'm telling you. You cannot say, I don't believe in Jesus, but then say, I believe in George Washington. Because there is the evidence for Jesus Christ as a historical event and for his resurrection is so strong comparatively. In other words, historically speaking, there is extraordinary evidence for Jesus. Take any other figure from the ancient world. It's not even close. It's not even close. So, in conclusion, there's no way to adequately explain the historical data apart from just taking the disciples at their word. That is, that they walked and lived with a man named Jesus of Nazareth. And he claimed that he was the fulfillment of the scriptures that all the Old Testament prophesied about. And he performed miracles that blew people's minds that they couldn't believe. They saw it and they said, truly God has come among us. And he died and they didn't know what had happened. And all their hopes were dashed because they thought he was going to be the king of Israel who was going to throw off the Roman yoke. And they were terrified and they were cowards and they were in a dark room. And then a bunch of fanatic women bust in the door and say the tomb's empty. And they say, what? And they ran to the tomb and they say, what in the world happened? And they go back and they're skeptical. And then two disciples, they don't know what to do. So they take a walk and this man starts walking with them. And they go and break bread and they saw that it was Jesus. And then later that evening, they're in a room with a locked door and Jesus appears among them and says, see my hands, see my side. Do you have something I can eat? And it changed their life, and it changed human history. Because God intervened in the world to once and for all fully and finally reveal himself to his creatures. I want to close with this quote. I read it. I think it was on Easter when I read it, but I want to read it again as we think about the life of Christ. It says, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race. I am well within my mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. Jesus is alive. And that's our hope. It's our hope. And it changes everything. The way we think, the way we act, the way we speak, the way we look at the world. God, the Shakespeare has entered the play. And he's revealed his plan for us. And that's what we get to be part of as children